I grew up on a farm on Waterboro Hill, and that is in the town of Ellington. And Greg explained to you a little bit about Ellington. It's on the easternmost side of Chautauqua County. It's bounded on the east by Cattaraugus County, on the south by the town of Poland, on the north by the town of Cherry Creek, and on the other side by the town of Geary. It contains about 1,360 acres, and it presently has a population, according to the last census, of about 1,638 people. I suspect that's going down. I suspect it will not be 1,638 by the time we get done with the present census.
Education. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I went to school Fredonia. I had both my bachelor's and my master's from Fredonia. Then I did graduate work at a lot of different places, UB, Buff State, Plattsburgh, Cornell University, Ithaca College. I kind of just went around and took courses that interested me and I thought would help me working with boys and girls. Kids have always been kind of my thing, and I just wanted to do what I could for boys and girls.
Who are you rooting for in the upcoming Final 16, Sweet 16? I want you to know. I mean, I see one of your mentioned here.
Well, now I'm going to make some enemies and make some friends. I guess I'm just going to keep quiet and not tell you.
Well, you're not. I see Cornell University,
Cornell,
the big red.
Well, I'd have to.
Come on.
Say Cornell.
Yeah. So you didn't make any enemies?
No enemies.
Yeah, because they know they're the Cinderella team. You wrote in your book, Ellington and His People, in the something that history is a guide to navigation in perilous times. History is who we are and why we are the way we are. How did you pick that quote from David McCullough?
Well, I know he's a person who has been here to Chautauqua Institution many, many times, and that just has always been a favorite quotation of mine, and I think it tells so much about history. So I thought, I've got to write that in all the books I wrote. So for almost 400 times, I wrote David McCullough's statement, and let me tell you, my hand was getting tired after doing that.
By the way, we did bring a couple of extra books here tonight if you're interested. This is a major league effort here. I mean, I'm looking at the number of sites and pages, and this must have been daunting. Who conned you into doing this?
Well, the 200th anniversary of the first settler of the town of Ellington is taking place sometime during this decade. And whether, depending on the historian you look at or read about, it's either 2011 to 2014. The first settler was probably, at least the family name, was Bentley. Was a man by the name of Joshua Bentley. And a little later I'd like to tell you a story about Joshua Bentley, to tell you about our early pioneers, and I'm not sure I could have been a pioneer. I always kidded my mother and I said, if we had been a pioneer family, we'd probably stayed over on the coastline of the United States, on the east coastline. We might not have come to the interior. Joshua Bentley, or his son, who was also Joshua, probably came to Ellington in about 1814. I think we can probably settle on that date. Although there was another man who came a year or two before, and he came in the summertime and built a crude shelter, and he stayed for maybe a month during the summertime, and then he vamoosed back east. He'd had enough of the Willers area of Chautauqua County.
I don't know if there's a good segue here or not, but talk about guys who had enough of Chautauqua County and moved west. And is this guy who you wrote about, the rule of King Strang? And I thought it's such a great story. and I don't even know quite how to get into it other than to ask you to talk about it. Maybe his roots here in Ellington, and then ultimately his connection with the Mormons, and just kind of work your way through that.
Okay. Well, in the early history books, there was not too much information about this fellow. By the way, he was born in 1812 in the center part of New York State, and he was born with the name Jesse James Strang. And I say, taking a little historical license at tongue-in-cheek, he probably knew that many years later there was going to be a famous American outlaw by the name of Jesse James, so he didn't want that. So at the age of 19, he changed his name to James Jesse Strang. So when we refer to him, by the way, I have some homework for you. Being the school teacher, I'm going to give you the story of James Jesse Strang afterwards, so you can take it home and read it. And I'll just tantalize you with some ideas about this fellow. Born in 1812, had a very short life. He was assassinated in 1856. He was a charismatic and a brilliant guy, but he was also a fellow who, when he was a tiny, tiny child, always was thinking ahead and saying to himself, how can I become somebody? How can I become a leader? How can I become important? He was born into a farm family, and they moved from Scipio, the town of Scipio in central New York State, and they came to the area around Forestville, New York, along the shoreline of Chautauqua County for our friends from Germany. And he grew up there. And I'm going to tantalize you with this story. When he was a little boy, he started writing a diary about his life. He always, always, always wanted to get ahead. And he put most of this diary in secret code. And this code was not broken until 1960s. So that's quite a while. I think maybe during the Second World War, he would have made a good person to do code work in terms of the Second World War. James got to Ellington when he was a young man, about 19 years of age. He came to the area. He had studied law. He wasn't sure as a young man what he wanted to do. At one time he thought he would be a fur trader. That's kind of an interesting, but think we're talking now early 1800s. Then he thought he might go into government work. Then he thought he might become a politician. He finally decided to become a lawyer. At the age of 15, he was in Forestville, New York. He attended grade school there. But the age of 15, and for you ladies, excuse me, and maybe you can explain to me what this means. He reported in his diary he was an energetic womanizer. Now, that's kind of an interesting statement. But I think I know what it means when I read further and found out that he fell madly in love with a 20-year-old lady from Forestville who already had a child whose first name was Nancy. And his father and mother found out. So they promptly shipped him off to Fredonia Academy to get him out of Forestville, where incidentally the tuition was $3 for a term, and I think room and board was not much more. He boarded with a Fredonia family. But unbeknownst to his parents, he was corresponding with Nancy. And Nancy wanted to get married, and James was a kid of 15. Now I know they grew up faster back then, but he was 15 years of age. He didn't want to get married. And his parents allowed him to come home at the end of the fall term And they discovered very shortly that Nancy and he was still Jesse at the time. He wasn't 19 yet. Nancy and Jesse were still carrying out their affair. So Dad and Mom promptly sent him back to Fredonia Academy again. And I think Dad applied a little influence and said, look, you've got to pay for some of this money for tuition. So he rang the school bell, and his tuition was cut in half, which is kind of interesting. So that's kind of an inkling. Let me see what else I want. In Ellington, and I don't want to give it all away because I want you to read this later on tonight or tomorrow or sometime at your convenience. He became postmaster of Ellington. He became postmaster because I jokingly say he was probably the only Democrat in the whole town of Ellington, and when the Democrats got in power, he became postmaster. I suspect there aren't too many Democrats in the town of Ellington to this very day, although if I were there, I would happen to be one. He married. He always had an interest in the ladies. He was a ladies' man, and he had numerous liaisons with people. He went to teach school in Randolph, New York, and maybe I can just tell you a couple of things about that. Let's see where this is. He bought some material for his teaching, and I thought this was very interesting. Let's see if I can find it right here fast.
By the way, while he's looking, the fact of the matter was that he got involved in religion. He was a Baptist for a period of time. I'm not sure the fact he was a Baptist and a womanizer matched, but
in fact, that's why he was thrown out of the Baptist church, because they found out he was such a womanizer.
it happens.
It happens. Well, here it is. This is November of 1831, and this is what he bought. I think school teachers ought to buy these books now. He bought some toys for school at $1.25. I don't know what the toys were, but he bought the following books. Books of Nature for $1.37.5. Lexicon of Useful Knowledge for $1.50. American Constitution for $1.25. And Life of Napoleon for $1.25. Isn't that interesting that those are the books he chose? While he was in Randolph, he was only there a few weeks, and the rumor around town was that, he was having an affair with a married lady from Randolph. Her name was Mary Torrance, if any of you know, and I spoke about this in Randolph, and I was a little leery because there's a Torrance Road, and there are a lot of Torrances who still live in Randolph, so I said, I hope I'm not talking about your great-great-grandmother. But it didn't go on very long because he said in his diary that he had other things to do. He said Mary had playfully kissed him a couple of times. James married a young girl from Ellicottville, New York. She apparently was very depressed, was not a happy person, and maybe because she lived with James, I'm not sure. At one point, they went down south to visit her father because she was having problems, and they came back and they lived with James's parents, who were in Cherry Creek, New York. And it was at that point that their first child, called Little Mary, was born. So now there are 2 children, and before they left Clear Creek in a few years, he was postmaster for 8 years in Ellington. And he also became editor of a Randolph newspaper. And then he got the 7-year itch, and he decided that he wanted to go west. So they moved out to Burlington, Wisconsin. Now, you may want to interrupt me and say, you're talking too much.
No, but this is, see, Burlington, Wisconsin starts an interface with your guy with the Mormon Church,
With
because
the Mormon Church.
as I recall it was Mary's relative who was involved in the creation of a church out there in Burlington. And now we get into the world of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and the world takes off here.
The world does take off. Unfortunately, little Mary, who was born in Clear Creek, the whole family became very ill and little Mary died. And some say that this may be the reason why the family turned to Mormonism, but Mary's relatives were Mormons, and so James went to hear Joseph Smith preach, and he was enamored by Joseph Smith, and before he left, he was baptized into the Mormon Church. And apparently Joseph Smith was very interested in James, because he said, why don't you found a colony, a Mormon colony in Burlington, Wisconsin? And so James went back to Burlington, and just outside of Burlington he founded a community of about 2,000 people. He called Voree, V-O-R-E-E, or the Garden of Peace. This is kind of an aside I didn't say in the book, but my daughter and my son and I went to Burlington 2 years ago to do some research. And I knew that James was probably buried in the Burlington Cemetery, so that was my intent. But I also knew that there were still some stone buildings left that were constructed by the Mormons. And James's group of Mormons were called Strangite Mormons. So when you hear me say later on Strangite Mormons, that is James' group of people. The Strangite Mormons started a large temple in Voree. They built beautiful stone buildings. They had a tithing house.
What state was in Voree? Where is it? Is it Wisconsin?
Burlington, Wisconsin. And when I stopped there, I went to the Chamber of Commerce and asked for a map to go to the cemetery. And the lady, who was a lovely lady, very refined, well-dressed, said, you have relatives in the cemetery? And I said, no, I'm looking for a Mormon prophet by the name of James Strang. She said, never heard of it. I'm sure there are no Mormon prophets in this town. And I said, well, you have a community just outside of this town. It no longer exists, but there are still some stone houses, I've been told, left, called Voree. She said, I've never heard of it. I'm sure you're wrong. Well, I got the map, and we found some of the stone houses. We found an active Strangite church. There are 2 active Strangite churches to this day just outside of Burlington. We went to the cemetery. Burlington's not a large community, and my daughter and my son and I separated, and we hunted and could not find a grave. And we decided to go get some ice cream, and along the way there was a fellow by the road coming out of a house with a little girl, and I said, let's stop and ask him if he knows anything about it. So my son jumped out. He'll like this story. And the fellow put his fist up to my son, and he said, I thought you were going to arrest me. I thought you were going to serve a warrant for me. He turned out, he spent the whole afternoon with us and his little girl. Turned out that he and his wife were going through a very serious divorce. His wife's brother was a famous football player, and to this day I'm not sure who he was. And in the lawsuit, the family had become fighting with one another, and he was writing a book about all his troubles, and the family was going to fight him, so he thought that. Well, he said, I know exactly where his grave is. So we went back. Well, he couldn't find it either. And he said, well, there's another cemetery just up the way where there was an epidemic in the 1830s and where they wouldn't bury people in the regular cemetery. Let's walk up there. So we walked up there. No grave up there. And he said, well, there's another cemetery. And I said, well, I assume it's a Catholic cemetery in town. He said, I don't really know. And I said, he would be buried, I think, in a Protestant cemetery, not the Catholic cemetery. Well, we went over there, and that was a Catholic cemetery. So we went back, and I said to my children, I'm not giving up. Let's look once more. And I was looking for probably an impressive monument, and my daughter found it, and it was a small, simple stone, which just had the name James Jesse Strang, the date of his birth and the date of his death. No flowers. I've been to Mark Twain's grave in Elmira, New York, and there are signs, and that's what I was looking for. Nobody in Burlington, Wisconsin really knows much about James Strang. It's kind of played down. James left Burlington because the people of Burlington area the Mormons were always in trouble with the locals. The Mormons were kind of the people that you loved to hate if you were their neighbors. They had, quote unquote, a bad reputation, and the non-Mormon people would attempt to send the wagons back to the east or the west for the immigrants coming in. Nobody would sell the Mormons land without a surcharge, so James knew he had to get his people out. So he ended up and some of you have, I know most of you have been to Mackinac Island in Michigan. Beaver Island is not too far away from Mackinac Island. It is 55 miles from the mainland. It's an hour-and-a-half ferry ride today to go from the coast, from the mainland to Beaver Island. Went to Beaver Island, and I tell you, I want all of you to go to Beaver Island someday. Beaver Island was originally, it was an Indian community, and then the Irish came to the island. And the Irish came, guess why? They sold whiskey to the Indians in trade for the fish that the Indians caught. So it was a favorite Irish community. But when James came in, he was a teetotaler. And so when James got into power, no alcohol on the island. And let's see, I've got to back up on this story. I need to tell you about his coronation. How he got to be king.
Before that, let me read something that you wrote.
Okay.
Because this is going to tie in with just about everything you read, and this is going to just talk about illuminate you. James, as he was splitting away from other Mormon groups, thought he better create a separate enforcement agency.
Oh.
See if this sounds familiar. He created a, quote, secret order called the Illuminati, an enforcement agency. The members swore to uphold and obey James as the imperial primate and actual sovereign lord and king on earth. New members were inducted by being taken into a darkened room, and their heads were anointed with oil. Mysteriously, their heads began to glow in the dark, caused by the liquid composed of oil and phosphorus. This guy was good. He even went one step further. He dug out, and maybe you're going to talk about this, Roger, and
No,
you tell me to stop, but
you go ahead.
James produced, this is all part of this guy's Ellington, Chautauqua County. James produced an important but controversial letter called the Letter of Appointment. Now, some of you may remember what happened to Joseph Smith, but a letter supposedly written by Joseph Smith on June 18th, naming him, James, as his heir. James traveled around the country showing the letter to Mormon leaders everywhere, all these various groups, citing the fact that he was the heir apparent to Joseph Smith. And that when Joseph Smith was, and as it turned out, the letter was written June 18th. On June 27th, Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were killed by a mob in Carthage, Illinois. On June 27th, as I mentioned, only 4 months after James was baptized. I mean, this happened quickly. So you can imagine, James is baptized. 4 months later, this guy's got a letter. He produces a letter saying, I'm the heir apparent to the top dog, Joseph Smith. Enter Brigham Young, who also claims leadership. Things carry on, but there's this one group. Our guy from Chautauqua County, he's off on a roll. He's got a letter. He's got the Illuminati. He's got something cooking here. That's the setup. Here we go.
Some of you may have, and if you haven't, I suggest you do this. Go to Kirkland, Ohio, just outside of Cleveland. There's a temple in Kirkland, Ohio. It's just off the expressway. It doesn't take long to go. It is now owned and operated by the Community of Christ, which is a Mormon division. Kirtland Temple was a stronghold of James, the Strangite religion, and James came and gave a sermon for 3 hours. That's probably more than we'd like to do, and stay in church for a 3-hour sermon. But a sermon of 3 hours.
You keep them short of that, don't you, Maureen?
Oh, glad.
In trying to convince the people that he was the leader. And in some ways, believe it or not, James almost won over Brigham Young, because just think, it was really more appealing for Mormons to think, hey, I can go to Michigan rather than going to the wilderness of Utah, because they really didn't know about Utah. Michigan was much closer. So James ended up in Beaver Island. And when James was in Ellington, he not only was against liquor, but he preached against polygamy, because as Joseph Smith traveled from Palmyra, New York, where the Mormon religion was founded, to go to the Stakes of Zion, which were gathering places in the Midwest and the West, they passed through Chautauqua County. So James was violently anti-polygamist in Ellington. But guess what? He got to the cold, cold nights of Beaver Island. He became a polygamist. He married 5 wives. And maybe I ought to read this, because I think this just kind of tells you about James. He was a charismatic and a brilliant man. Yet he was a man of many, many contrasts. He was kind and loving. He could be very, very cruel. He was a strident opponent of polygamy, yet he would marry 5 wives. He was a brilliant editor, and yet he was an incendiary propagandist. He was a legislator, and I have to tell you about that. And yet he was a lawbreaker. He was a progressive. When he came to Beaver Island, he gave all of his people, they could get to come, 160 acres of free land, plus he gave them a retirement home in one of the small villages. Now, think back when that was. That's pretty good. You not only got 160 acres of free land, but you got a retirement home when you could no longer work. So this fellow was really an interesting character who walked a real tightrope in life. I have to tell you, when James was assassinated, and I'll tell you about that a little later, his first wife, Mary, who lived with him in Clear Creek, New York, near Ellington, had left him. She got disgusted. Mary never liked the other wives. That was not her thing. So Mary had left James on Beaver Island, and she'd gone back to Voree to live. And James first married another school teacher, and before he died, he had 4 other wives. So when he was assassinated, 4 of his 5 wives were pregnant. 4 children were born after James was assassinated. Now let's see. His coronation. Decided that he was going to be declared king of Beaver Island, and so his second wife and one of his followers arranged an impressive ceremony in an unfinished temple. They started another temple on Beaver Island, which was supposed to be the largest, most exclusive and beautiful building in the entire world, located on Beaver Island. There were about 400 people in attendance. Keep in mind, this is wilderness area, so they had to improvise. So they took a chair and put moss on it, and that was his throne. They had some banners that they made by hand that put up on either side with the rising sun. He was brought into the temple by the sounding of 70 trumpets, followed by many, many church dignitaries, and he was crowned king. And afterwards, the Mormons had purchased a cannon, and so they fired the cannon, and then they shouted, "Long live King James," and then they had a celebration. And each member of the Strangite group had to bring James a chicken and a heifer. And both the chicken and the heifer were killed without breaking a bone in either the chicken's or the young heifer's body. And it was cooked up and they had a feast. That happened to be the 4th of July. Just timed so the non-Mormons, the Gentiles as they called them, the Strangites called the other people, the Gentiles had their 4th of July celebration, but the Strangite Mormons had King's Day, the celebration of King James. I guess I better tell you how King James was assassinated. At first he was kind and good, and then the poor fellow got power, and everything went to his head, so he became kind of cruel, and he devised some very cruel laws for his own followers. Among them was the fact that all of his women must wear bloomers. Now, you ladies remember that there was an Amelia Bloomer in Western New York who was a lawyer. She developed this kind of, I guess it's kind of a pantsuit, a discreet pantsuit, as opposed to the long dresses at the time. And James said that all of his women followers had to wear the bloomers. 2 of the women refused, and obviously it wasn't the women's fault that they refused. It was the husband's fault. So James had the husbands horsewhipped. And these 2 fellows and another fellow who was a doctor who had kind of a drinking problem, and James had threatened to throw him off Beaver Island, started to plot against him. And there was a lot of politics going on in the background, and they, with the politicians of Upper Michigan, convinced Millard Fillmore, the President of the United States, to send a warship to get James and try him for treason, for counterfeiting because he had his own money, for mail fraud because he developed his own mail system. Can you imagine? And I have to tell you, at the same time, this guy was a member of the Michigan legislature. He ran for the legislature for 2 years, and he didn't see any unusual quality with being a member of the Michigan legislature and being the leader of a foreign country, as he said. So Millard Fillmore had a lot of pressure. So Millard Fillmore sent the warship. It was a paddle-wheeled frigate, the USS Michigan, to come to Beaver Island. Now here's an aside. The USS Michigan was built in Erie, Pennsylvania. If you want to take a side trip, go to the Maritime Museum, which is in the library down on the waterfront, and I see some of you nodding at Erie, and you can see the hull of the USS Michigan. The USS Michigan was kind of the protector of the whole Great Lakes area. And when the captain got his ship outside of St. James, notice St. James, of course, named for James Strang, he was summoned to board the ship. He was shackled, and he was taken to Detroit, where he and some of his followers were tried. A lot of politics going on in the background, and they were found innocent of mail fraud, and the other charges were quietly dropped. Greg could probably explain this much better than I could. I'm not sure what went on. But he went back. But 2 years later, President Fillmore was still getting a lot of, you've got to do something about this crazy, crazy guy named James Strang. So the warship went back to pick him up, to arrest him again. And as he was being brought down to the dock, the two husbands who had been flogged because their women refused to wear bloomers, they shot him from behind, they pistol whipped him, and he wasn't killed outright. He died 12 days later. And these three men, along with the doctor I mentioned to you, ran to the USS Michigan for safety. They were taken over to Mackinac Island and fined $1.25 each. They were really treated as heroes. You killed this terrible man, James Strang. James was buried. You're not going to have to read my story now afterwards. James was buried in the old Mormon cemetery in Vary. Mary, his first wife, was made executor of his estate. James had no money. The church had no money. So a year or so later, there had to be a sheriff's auction, and everything had to be sold. Mary's family, who were somewhat wealthy, the Pierce family, bought the house where Mary lived in Vary and gave it to her. But the cemetery and the other land was bought by a Gentile farmer who was very angry at James, and so he built his pig pen around the cemetery, which is an insult, and he arranged the pig pen barn so that when the barn door opened, the pig would have to run out over James's grave. And so in a year or two, there was not much left of this Mormon cemetery. So in 1935, James's daughter gathered up, I don't know, I may have this wrong, you can check me, Greg, $50 or $100, and made a collection, and they bought this simple 1935 monument, which I saw in the cemetery, and had it placed in the cemetery. And I told this story, and this is poetic license, but right next to James's grave is a huge white marble monument, beautiful, with an eagle on the top, dedicated to the fallen heroes of Burlington, the war heroes. And I said, you know, James had such a enormous ego that he must have been happy that the war heroes had a nice monument, but very sad that he had such a tiny little picayune monument. With that, I'm going to stop. I've talked too much.
Well, I mean, just a couple other vignettes. One is there is a life mask of James that's been located in Chautauqua County. And I'm not quite exactly sure when, but during the time period of 1843 to maybe 1849. I'm curious why he was of such note that somebody thought to do that, or did he just think that he was have such ego that he'd do it himself?
I'm not sure why the life man, although he wasn't, in Beaver Island, I didn't tell you, he had 3,600 followers at the height of his time. That's a lot of people who followed him. Today, if anybody's interested in this room, you can run right out the door. There's a great quantity of money. There was no money at the time James died. Now it's built up. They're waiting for a new Strangite prophet to come. I'm told that there's, I don't know what a great quantity of money is, and I really wanted to find out, but I couldn't. In some Michigan bank, awaiting for the signature of the new prophet of the Strangite religion to have that money released. Now they asked James's sons to be prophets. They refused. As of today, there's no prophet. 2 years ago, there were 2 active churches. One of them has now stopped. It's really a vacant building now. The other church is a modern church with, I suspect, they say, if you go on the website, Strangite Religion, it's a marvelous website. It will tell you a lot. But somebody is a beautiful webmaster. But I suspect, they say they have 200 or 300 people. I suspect there's probably 100 Strangite Mormons left. There are no Strangite Mormons on Beaver Island. I asked that question. There's a little museum, which was James's print shop on Beaver Island. When I was there, there's a 2-room museum dedicated to the history of Beaver Island and the life of James Strang, with a delightful director named Bill Cashman, who was about 86 years old. And I asked Bill, and he said, well, wait a few minutes. He said, maybe a Strangite will come in. Well, pretty soon this guy came in with long ponytail, no teeth, tie-dye shirt, and he said, oh, here he comes now. Well, he came over and Bill introduced me to him, and he said his parents were Strangites. He wasn't a practicing Strangite. And I said, well, I bet you could tell a lot of stories. And he did tell some stories about the church. But I think maybe some of us in this room ought to find out. Maybe we could say we want to be the new prophet of the Strangite Mormons. And I don't mean to sound as I'm putting them down at all. Obviously, James was charismatic. How could he get 3,600 people to follow him? He certainly had some very fine ideas, but he also had some rather kooky ideas too, and that was his downfall.
The guy who was in charge of his grand coronation, which you talked about, a guy named George Adams, who was also one of the leaders and a good friend of James, within 4 months of the coronation was excommunicated for hanky-panky, which involved women, whiskey, and money. Now, a little hypocrisy, perhaps? Or was there more to that George Adams story?
Well,
I just think of Frank Sinatra, ride high in April, shot down in May, That's life.
some of the historians will tell you that of all James's qualities, he wasn't a good judge of other people. And he seemed to surround himself with some followers who really didn't help him out in any way, shape, or form, including this George Adams, who was a Shakespearean actor, itinerant preacher, you name it. He had that job. He did it. He kind of had a lot of different positions.
Totally unrelated, but you talk about the Irish in Beaver Island. You had this little quote in the book, which I just love. After James' death, Irish immigrants again returned to the island because they were kind of whisked away because of James. And in 1881 census, which we're going through now, of course, there were on Beaver Island 141 Gallaghers, 123 Boyles, and 90 McDonalds out of only 800 residents. You gotta love Beaver Island.
And please go there someday, because the Irish are still there today. It is as Irish, I mean, the red hair, the freckles. And I had hired a guide whose name was Shaughnessy to take us around. And Shaughnessy turned out to be a retired college professor from the mainland, a history professor. And after about 5 minutes, I said, I know your occupation in life. And he said, how do you know that? And I said, well, I do. You were a history professor in a college. He was. Delightful. This is the type of thing. When we got there, I had written to Bill Klingman, the director of this little museum, and so he was waiting for me. And you know, I was like a long-lost friend. You get off the dock, and it's almost like you're getting off at Ellis Island during when Ellis Island was active, because there are people coming back to the island, and there are people leaving, and families gathering. And you can imagine, the only way you can get to Beaver Island in the wintertime, from about October to about April or May, is by seaplane. It's totally, that's the only way you get in and get off. And there are about 350 year-round residents. Well, Bill said, how long are you staying? And I said, well, we're leaving by the night ferry. And he said, you can't. He said, we're having a front porch special tonight. And I thought, what in the world is a front porch special? Now, there are very, very few roads on Beaver Island. There's 7 miles of paved road, which is mainly in St. James along the waterfront. And most of the homes on the island are in St. James. And he said, well, we're going down to the end of the street. And he said, and every home has a front porch looking out on the lake. And he said, we set our chairs up in the street. And he said, the first home, somebody might come out and wheel the piano out on the porch and do a piano solo. He said, we pick our chairs up, we go to the next house. Someone might come out and read poetry. So we pick our chairs up and we go to the next house, and someone might come out and sing a song. And I thought, what a wonderful, wonderful area this is. And actually, few cars on the island. Basically what cars they are date back to the 50s or 60s. They're trying to convince everybody on the island to go to electric cars. About 10 years ago, they ran a power line under the lake so they'd have electricity, but they don't like that because they don't like to be beholden to the mainland. So they're trying to go to solar power and wind power on the island. And I'm thinking, oh folks, I love you. This is great. This is super. When we got done with the tour, I said to Shaughnessy, and there was a Shamrock bar down there. There's a 6-unit motel and a Shamrock bar. And I said to Shaughnessy, is it okay? Is that a good place to go eat? We've got to get something to eat. And he said, nah. I don't want you to go there. I said, that's touristy. Now, very few tourists go to the island. But he said, I don't want you to go there. He said, I'm going to take you back. And so we went on this sandy road, not developed at all, about 1.5 miles out St. James. And here was a little Irish bar. It was about 2 o'clock. And he said, somebody will bring you back. Don't worry, somebody will bring you back. So we went in, and They were having a grand time in there. There was just families in there, singing, having a great time. And we were welcome. I think we paid $6 for appetizer, main meal, dessert, and beverage. Can you imagine? So when we got done, I said to the lady who took our money, can you walk us out and just point us back to St. James? Because there were 4 sandy roads, and I wasn't sure which road went back to St. James. And she said, of course not, I'll take you back. Well, she turned out to be the owner of the restaurant. And I said, you don't have to do that, ma'am. She said, no, of course, you're my guest. So she said, just a second, I've got to wait on these people. They're so Irish that they wrote to Guinness in Ireland and asked to have Guinness beer imported. Guinness said, no, you have to get your Guinness beer from Canada. They refused. So they only import other Irish beer from Ireland. They won't have anything to do with Guinness Company now. So take that. So in a minute, she said, wait a minute, my husband just drove off in my car, but I borrowed one of my customers' cars. Now, can you imagine that in the States? So we piled into her car, went the 1.5 miles back on this sandy road, just sand. It was not developed at all. Back to St. James, and I pulled out my pocket and I said, I want to give you something. She said, absolutely not. But as we were driving back, I said, I assume, obviously she was Irish, and I said, I assume you were born on the island? And she said, oh no. She said, my husband and I were in California 2 years ago in middle management, and she said, we got tired of the rat race. And she said, we knew about it, Beaver Island. We knew it was Irish, and we decided to come to the island. So she said, we sold everything. She said, and this was a year later, 2 years ago. She said, everything is still in trunks. And she said, we've been here a year, we're going to be here another year, which would have been last year. And she said, my husband and I have agreed, we're going to a third world country and we're going to help other people because we want to do something for the world. And I was going, marvelous. And the whole attitude of the people on the island, we were walking down the street, it was a hot day, and somebody said, come in, we have lemonade. And you know, like, we were total strangers, 3 total strangers. No, come in. You look warm. We want you to have some lemonade with us. Even in marvelous Chautauqua, that wouldn't happen. And in most places in Chautauqua County, that wouldn't happen. Hopefully it would. But it still does on Beaver Island. So you've got to go to Beaver Island. When you go to Mackinac Island and spend time at the Grand Hotel, take a side trip to Beaver Island.
We've got about 5 minutes, and I know that questions. Maureen?
Well, I just wondered, Roger, you said that James had bestowed 160 acres on each of the families of his followers, and was there any evidence that any of those families still had holdings on Beaver Island?
No, and I didn't tell you, and when I hand you the paper, you will read. As soon as James was assassinated, kind of a mob instinct came, and you know, the island was important in some ways. Within 4 days, ships were brought in, and they gave the Mormons half a day. You can take 1 trunk with you, you may take nothing else. And people were dropped off in all ports. People were dropped in Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, and the people in Chicago, the Mormons were dropped off in Chicago. Can you imagine these poor people who had homes and things and just 1 trunk? And they said to the ship captain, what do we do? And he said, you're Mormons, get off the ship. I don't care what you do. So the James's followers were scattered to all points of the globe afterwards. Some of them united back, but most of them did not. So that kind of answers your question.
What
Yeah,
organization were the ships from?
I don't really know. I think probably it was, I have a book back there which I found in Erie, Pennsylvania. And I've got to decide, and then it will answer your question. There's really a controversy about, how did the U.S. government get in this? And the USS Michigan. And probably the United States government, they certainly didn't protect James or his followers when these people came in. There were land speculators who came in, and I don't know whether land speculators loaded up the Mormons. And James confiscated the land from the Irish. He didn't pay the Irish for the land, so he threw the Irish off the island. So maybe what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And after James was assassinated, his followers received the same treatment. They just threw him off the island. There are no Strangite Mormons on Beaver Island today. No practicing Strangite Mormons.
Two things, how large is the island and who were the native tribes that were there originally?
55 square mile island. So it's a pretty good sized island. And it is a string of islands which once connected with the mainland, and then as geology and the movements and the rising of the earth and so on took place, these became little islands. Some of the islands became burial spots for the Indians as sacred ground, and they only used them for burial spots. But Beaver Island is the biggest island, and it became a place for steamships to pull in to fuel with firewood. So that's what the Mormons did to make their money. They cut firewood and sold it to the steamship companies who pulled it. And it was a beautiful harbor in St. James. And actually, Mackinac Island was kind of the island in the area, but when the Mormons came in, it almost became true that Beaver Island overtook Mackinac Island, and the people of Mackinac Island didn't like it. So there was kind of a war between Beaver Island and Mackinac Island. And it took James a while to get rid of the Irish. There's a lighthouse at St. James they call Whiskey Point, and the locals will tell you about the war at Whiskey Point. When James was coronated, remember I told you I had the cannon, and they fired the cannon. Well, the day before they'd fired this cannon off to where the Irish were secretly plotting to wipe out the Mormons. And the Mormons got wind of it. So they fired one cannon back, and it hit Whiskey Point. And I don't know what happened. It sounds like I'm now... But the Irish didn't defend themselves, and they took off. So the locals will tell you, well, the war of Whiskey Point was over without really only 2 shots being fired.
Whiskey shots.
Were there native peoples that were there?
The natives, James called, the Mormons called the Indian people Lamanites, and they thought that the Lamanites, they called them inferior people. And with education, which they wanted to do, James says, and there's a delightful quote in the book you can read, he thought with education they would again become a white and delightsome people. Figure that one out. So the Indians were just forced out totally. They were just kicked out, and no recompense at all, no payments, nothing. There are a few Indian families on Beaver Island today that have come back, but mainly it's the Irish who have come back and live there now.
Right?
And is there any documentation about the stance that the mainline Mormon Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, how did they view the Strang branch?
Good question. Before getting into this, when I thought of the Mormon church, I foolishly thought it was probably just one church. You know, we hear about the Utah Mormon church. There is a Missouri Mormon church too. There's probably 160 different Mormon churches. Remember a number of years ago reading about the kooks in Utah and all of this. Those are also small branches of the Mormon church. The Community of Christ, the Mormon church whose headquarters are in Salt Lake City, the Mormon church whose headquarters are in Missouri, are the main churches. I have a book that I brought in called Written by a Mormon, who talks about, hopefully, maybe someday, all these churches can get back together again, but says there's been too much that's happened in the past. It's just not going to happen. And I think the Strangite Mormons will probably disappear. There was a Winfield W. Watson who lived on the island with James, and he made a lot of money. And I think most of this money now, which is in the bank somewhere, is Winfield Watson's money. And it's going to be very interesting, and maybe we should all follow what does happen. Are they ever going to release this money to anyone? You'd think somehow somebody could work out something so that the money could go to maybe for social, for economic help for some people. I don't think the church is very active, but go on the net and you'll think that the Strangite Mormons are one of the biggest churches around. Not true.
Ladies and gentlemen, Roger Gilbert, thank you very much, Roger.